Welcome to Tanuki Fishing Webinar, Fly Fishing with Tenkara Rod. The fundamentals of Tenkara Rod Fishing with Matt Sment. This episode is about line. Matt, would you like to take it over?
Yeah, we'll talk about line length in just a moment. I'm seeing your question about line length. I see the question about leader on the water, just a fly. We will get to that. Okay, I think I'm relatively caught up here, so we're going to move ahead. So we're going to talk about lines here. And before we jump any further in, we'll address that question. We'll go back to the concept of keeping the line off the water and using the length of the rod to do so. The longer you push your line past the length of your rod, the harder it's going to be to keep off the water, period. Now, there may be situations where you don't care how much line is on the water or you care less, but the further you extend that line, the harder it's going to be to keep off the water, and the more work you're going to have to do to hand line, which is going to pretty much increase the chance that you're going to lose fish. So I always recommend, and I personally typically fish a rod length of line and about 4 to 6 feet of tippet. Now, on warm water where I don't care if I'm like going after smallmouth again, and I know I'm talking about that, it seems more than trout, but it's a big, easily illustrated difference. If I'm going after smallmouth bass, I'm going to use a floating line probably, and I'm probably going to stretch that out probably another 5 or 6 feet than I pass the end of the rod tip length than I normally do, because I don't care if the line's on the water. Additionally, I typically stretch my tippet section out to my mono, because I don't waste tippet on bass, out to about 8 feet. So in situations where I need the range on like a big river or a lake, and situations where I don't care if the line is on the water, I will stretch the line out, as far as I can handle it. But typically, if I'm fishing for trout and I'm using lightweight line and stuff, I'm going to keep that line system rod length plus 4 to 6 feet of tippet, and that gives me a great deal of control. So let's actually delve into the lines here. First of all, we're going to talk about level line, which is very similar to what you've seen out of like a monofilament fishing line, but typically it's colored like this bright orange. You see, one of my favorites these days is bright pink, because I'm able to see that in just about any light conditions. You'll see like the high vis light green and pinks and oranges and stuff, and depending on you and your eyes, they will work better for you or worse for you depending on the color. But it's a big thing to be able to see your line, in my opinion, and so I've been working that a lot. But what is level line? Level line is a very lightweight, almost kind of like a monofilament, and it is the lightest of the line choices for Tenkara rod fishing. Its advantages are you can do great lightweight presentations with it. It's the easiest line to keep off the water and get a drag-free drift. It's relatively cheap and adjustable to get a whole spool. And as I just said, adjustable, since it's coming off of a spool, you can cut it short, and you can tie more sections onto it, or you can tie longer sections. It gives you a lot of options as far as rating and line length goes. Level line is probably the most common choice for Tenkara rod fishing, though it does have probably a higher learning curve than other line choices for beginners. It is ultimately the best way to keep the line off the water and keep control over the fly in most situations, in my opinion. Disadvantages, like I said, it can be kind of difficult to cast at first. There's a learning curve to it. Once you get it, though, once you get your cast stroke down, it works pretty well. I would recommend starting with like a size 4 level line. If you're nervous about going to a really lightweight line, like a lot of people fish 3, or I know folks that fish all the way down to 2, but if you're nervous about fishing something that light, or having trouble fishing something that light, go ahead and start with like a 4 or even a 4.5. It's still, even at that large size, going to be a smaller diameter and lighter than any other line choice. and then you can work your way down into lighter lines as you become more comfortable with that. So, you know, other potential disadvantages with the level line, or it could be, you know, I mentioned earlier, finding a color that you can see well. I also personally don't find level line well suited for larger flies in windy conditions. Again, you know, like if I'm throwing larger payloads, that's typically versus a warm water species like a bass or something. But yeah, like I think there's better choices for wind. The final thing that you'll run into with level line is line memory, which means that when you spool it up, it can kind of hold in place, and you get a wiggly, wavy line out of that that becomes hard to fish, hard to cast. And so like you've got to take a little time to straighten that line out when you despool it. But that's not overcomable. That's not a game changer or a showstopper by any means. It's just something that you need to be aware of in using that type of equipment. We're going to move on to furled line, which, you know, a good way to, we use modern materials now for furled line, polyester threads and all this stuff. But back in the day, they used to be made out of horsehair. And I think, you know, saying that makes it a little easier to visualize. One attribute of furled lines is typically they're tapered. So they're thicker on the end that attaches to the Tenkara rod, to the Lillian up there, and they get thinner in a particular profile as they approach the tip, and that allows the energy to transfer down the line easier. You can see, I think kind of on about the 4 or 5 o'clock position on that line there, there's a little tippet ring on the end of the line. So a lot of people who are dealing with eyesight challenges, and that is me over the last year or two, use these because of those tippet rings and how much easier they are to rig. And I think that's something to keep in mind as a potential benefit of furled lines. Some of the other advantages are, you know, you're throwing like polyester furled kind of woven rope, and you can get these very delicate presentations because it's transferring the energy so softly down through the line. I think they're best for dry flies personally, and they have zero line memory because it's fabric. So unless it freezes solid, you know, you're not going to get it caught in some kind of weird shape like that. The big disadvantage, one of the big disadvantages to furled line is that it's not adjustable. It is the length that it was manufactured in, and if you start cutting on it, you're going to do damage and make it unfishable. They also change characteristics once they're waterlogged. This, you know, I guess you can fight that by putting floatants on the line, but that's like one more thing for me to lose, so I'm not typically big on that. So, and as I mentioned earlier, like I like consistency in the systems that I fish. So like I'm not a big fan of the line changing personality once it gets waterlogged. Other people may not care, but that'll make it both harder to keep off the water and just harder to control the line and the fly in general. Obviously, it's going to freeze in cold weather, so I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't use it in sub-freezing fishing. Floating line makes a great cold weather option. We'll get to that in a moment. But furled line, definitely a warm weather option. And although I know people do use them for streamers and nymphing, I'm personally just not a big fan of furled lines for subsurface fishing. Again, the weight involved and the change of characteristics to me is kind of just a little bit more than I want to deal with. But you know, this may be the way you like to fish, so don't let my personal preferences color your experience. Finally, we're going to talk about floating line, which is, you know, typically made of the same PVC material that regular fly fishing floating line is made of, but is in a much smaller diameter. You're going to basically rate it up the same way wood furled line, and we'll touch on rating a little later. Floating line advantages, it's probably the easiest to cast, and that's because it's heavier, frankly. You know, it loads the rod easier, you can feel it easier. When I am teaching brand new Tenkara rod anglers how to fish, I almost universally use floating line because I can get them onto the basics of the mechanics fastest with this. there are some advantages and disadvantages, of course. This is the heaviest option, and therefore it's the hardest to keep the line off the water. It's not impossible. I fished floating lines for about 2 years straight on trout or on anything I fished. And it's not impossible to keep off the water, but it's a lot more difficult. And it definitely leaves a more visible signature in the environment for the fish as well. But it's got some great advantages. It's really easy to cast. It's super durable. I'm actually still fishing. I've got like 2 rods that I rigged up 4 or 5 years ago. I'm still fishing the same lines on those rods. They tangle a lot less and are easier to untangle than any of the other line choices. They have little to no line memory. It's very cost effective, wind resistant, easy to see. And if you are throwing heavier payloads like poppers or streamers or something, it's got more mass, which allows you to deliver that more accurately and with precision. So yeah, we talked a little bit about winter options. Fishing in sub-freezing temperatures, I'm almost universally going to use floating line these days. But then again, I'm also kind of lazy and I don't go out and get cold much either. So it doesn't happen much anymore. So yeah, let's move on to talking about tippet. Just straight up follow your manufacturer's recommendations for the maximum tippet load. I would personally tell you that I believe most of the manufacturer's recommendations are conservative estimates. I know I was able to consistently exceed the manufacturer's limitations on the rods that I was building, but I, had the luxury of being able to experiment in regards to that. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, don't be afraid to upglass your tippet if you need to, or throw like a 6-pound test mono on most rods. But in general, follow the manufacturer's recommendations, please. We talked about this a little earlier, but if I'm fishing for warm water, like bluegill and bass and stuff, they're just not spooky enough to justify using expensive tippet. So in that case, my favorite tippet is whatever the cheapest mono that's on sale at Walmart is. That's usually like, a 4 to 6 pound test. It's a little bit, it's a bigger diameter than tippet, but it breaks free when you need it to. It does everything that you need it to, and it does it a lot cheaper. So if you don't need to go expensive in order to catch those fish, by all means, don't do it. And then finally, length of tippet is terrain and situationally dependent. If I'm fishing really tight quarters, like just yesterday, I was in some, day before yesterday, I was in some really willow choked streams, and I usually have my tippet rigged up about 5 or 6 feet, and I brought it back down to about 4 to give myself a little bit more control in that environment. But I wouldn't ever drop below 3. Unless there's just a very, very specific situation or effect that you're trying to achieve. And I would say typically 4 to 6 feet. I typically do like a full wingspan of my arms and just cut it off there. And that works great. So before we move forward, let's do what we did with the rods thing, the rods, and try to talk. Are there any questions about line or tippet or what have you? Okay, so I see, can I swap out fixed Lillians with swivel tip Lillians? I think that would really depend on the model rod that you have. Typically, the Lillian is glued onto that tip section. So I've not seen a rod that has like a removable, replaceable tippet, or excuse me, Lillian. So I think you would have to get like a new tip section to do that. Okay, so about only the tippet and fly being on the water, we're gonna address that in casting technique here in just a moment. But yes, so yeah, Gene, you're on that. But we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in detail here in a moment. We can look your Mizushi up for you here in a minute, or if someone wants to look that up in the product description, I'm sure we'll say if they are still doing that. Jeff, you want to know, is the floating line similar to a 0.0 or 1 weight line diameter? I'm going to give you guys the secret lowdown here, because at Badger Tenkara, we were not the exact first to offer a Tenkara floating line, but we were definitely the first to push them really hard and really get the work done with them. And we did a lot of testing. And I would say that anything over 2 weight is going to cast excessively for you on most rods, and it's going to cause you to get like a snapback on the end of most of your casts, which is going to throw off your presentation. Yeah, like a 0 weight or a 1 weight or a 2 weight at max for your floating line. But that's all you need to be able to deliver large payloads or get the benefits. So like you know, I know you talk to people that like, yeah, I got an old 8 weight line laying around in the garage and stuff. I'm gonna tie that onto my 12-foot rod here. Yeah, you can, but you're gonna lose a lot of precision, accuracy, sensitivity, just by overpowering that piece of equipment with a heavy line. So that definitely would not be my approach, at least. Again, like as a specialist, you may be throwing together some sort of funky saltwater rig, and a heavier line might work well with that. But I think for 95% of Tenkara rod fishing situations, you're going to want to stick with the lighter end of those floating lines. Do certain rod actions work better with certain size level lines? So Andrew, what about tapered lines? Essentially, a tapered line is thicker on one end, thinner on the other end, in order to facilitate better transfer of energy through the line. You'll see a taper on some floating line designs, but the taper is almost exclusively going to be found on furled lines, and those are going to be like kind of manufacturers' proprietary recipes, so to speak. I know Brett at Dragon Tail's got different furled lines that are formulated for nymphing, streamers, various stuff, and he's built specific tapers in order to meet those. Okay, so our Patagonia's lines, light green color, what you can call floating lines. I'm not. I haven't seen one in a few years, but I'm pretty sure that was a PVC floating line, because Yvon Chouinard almost exclusively fishes he likes those floating lines. His style is much more of a hybrid between Western and Tenkara than it is Tenkara. But I don't know specifically, or excuse me, 100%. But I'm highly confident that the Patagonia lines are floating. You can check it just to see if it's a PVC material. Okay, so handmade tapered lines versus level lines. So again, it depends on what you're doing and what your preferences are. There are advantages to tapered lines, and you can build them with the level lines, so you're not dealing with the same disadvantages that you are with furled. I've never personally found a need to specialize into a specific line taper in order to address a particular situation. The longer I fish, the more, frankly, or I should say, the less complex my systems tend to get. I just, start realizing that, hey, I either need or don't need this, and I cut it out. And I personally don't use a lot of tapered leaders or tapered lines. Yeah, I see the next question here. We make tapered leaders for stand. Yeah, you can use those tapered leaders too, instead of a flat tippet section if you want to. And I would encourage you to experiment with that. Like, see if that works better for you. See if you might like it better. You might decide that it's not worth the work, but it's all going to be dependent on what works best for you. So hopefully that addresses that, Andrew. I'm sorry I didn't have a lot of really in-depth information for that. I've got Jeff Abramson here. What's your ideal level line length versus rod length for the best fly first, fly only on the water presentation? Jeff knows where I'm going with this as far as when we get to technique in a moment. Again, I'm going to go right back to rod length. And then honestly, like last summer, I was doing a lot of actually cutting the line at the top of the grip instead of at the full length of the rod. So it was like rod length minus a grip plus 4 to 6 feet of tippet. And I feel very in control of the fly and the cast with that length. That is a length that works well for me, that I probably fish that sort of scheme, that idea, probably 90% of the time. That would be my answer to that. But then as far as ideal, you know, again, Jeff, that's going to be terrain dependent, species dependent. You know, we got to stay flexible with that sort of stuff. But I don't feel you can go wrong with rod length plus 4 to 6 feet of tippet. Dennis Ford, how about 0.22 monocore competition series level line? I'm not familiar with it, but it seems of a diameter that would work just fine. And then, you know, if it casts fine for you and you're able to maintain line tension, control the fly, you know, complete all of the tasks that you need in order to control the fly, you know, it should work. It should work pretty well for you. You know, like I want to say the 0.22 is probably pretty close to a diameter of about a 2 weight. So I think, yeah, that should work well for you. Come back and tell us how it goes. You know, I mean, I'm always looking for more information. So, yeah, I'd be interested to know what you conclude on that. Okay, Peter Monsell, what about experimenting with a piece of running line from an old 4 or 5 weight line? By all means, you certainly can, but Peter, I think you're going to find that's probably still going to be overpowering the rest of your system. But I do recommend that you experiment with it. Like, folks, I got to be honest with you. I have done experiments that would make, like, I don't know, the Tenkara spirits roll over in their graves. I mean, I've picked up bass jigs out of Walmart that were on sale for $3 that literally I had to throw it out with my left hand while I held the rod with my right hand. You know, I've fished poppers, I've experimented like crazy, and I've learned a lot from it. It's been valuable. So yeah, like, try that out and then see is it overpowering your system? Are you able to do it accurately? My feeling, Peter, is that it's going to be probably a little heavier than you're going to want, depending on the rod that you're using. But yeah, like, maybe it's not. Go ahead and find out, though. You know, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit more about cast and technique, and I think between what we've talked about with equipment and that stuff, I think you'll get a good idea of what you're looking for in that, you know, in that system, and then you'll be able to judge if that 4 or 5 weight running line is going to do the trick for you. And I see, you know, we're talking how to fish Tenkara in lakes and ponds. And I know that's a big popular thing, and we're going to talk about, we're going to leave that for the second half here with technique and casting and fly manipulation, because the big difference there is you've got like the still water versus the running. Yeah, Kenneth Lewis, appreciate that question. Just help me out, and like when we get, you know, in 10-15 minutes down the road here, when we get into that stuff, you know, shoot that question back in there, so I just remember that we need to hit still water. Okay, appreciate it. As far as Dario, can I repeat the length? And I believe the length we were talking about is kind of like my ideal fly control length, and that is rod length plus 4 to 6 feet of tippet. It's that simple. Okay, and we're going to take one more line question from Ben and before we move on. Ben wants to know, how about the tapered nylon lines? I have not, you know, I fished those a couple of questions, or excuse me, a couple times, and they were okay. You know, it wasn't enough to really grab me and kind of take me down that direction. So to be honest, I haven't explored them super thoroughly. I believe they'll work just fine. But, you know, to go back to my experimenting earlier, I spent, like, the second year I was fishing Tenkara, I spent 3 weeks using an alternate line instead of Tenkara line. And that alternate line was the inside stretch of a 550 parachute cord, because I wanted to see, how that would work. And honestly, I did pretty well with it. It was summer, the fish were biting, they were eating. but all things considered, I did not find a stretch of 550 cord string to be any less effective than like a furled line. So I guess the point of all that is experiment. Don't be afraid to experiment. But I would recommend that you experiment slowly so you don't blow past noticing things that are changing as you're making changes in your systems. Okay, and Stevie Lee, I'm going to answer your question before we move on, because I think that's actually a really good and interesting question. And then we're going to take like a 2-minute intermission, and then we'll go into part 2 here.
Hey, Matt, before you
yeah.
move on, can I have a question? The audience sent in the question by mail, and I'm sorry I did not forward to you, but one of the question is, one of the audience have the tin rod, and what line should be good for tin rod? It's about
the tiny tin?
Yeah, tiny tin, yes.
I would just put like probably, if you're not sure, get some size 4 level line and start there.
Okay.
Especially with a shorter rod, I really wouldn't get into floating and furled lines because you're already that much closer, and you're losing advantage in the shortness of that rod length. So yeah, I would go with like a heavier. I would go with a heavier level line. Go with a 4, like a 4.5 level. I think will work out really well for you. And then we'll hit the bluegills. Then I'm going to take a brief 2-minute intermission, and then we'll roll on. As far as Stevie's question was, which size level line would someone use for casting longer distance? If the normal level line for the rod is a 3. And Stevie, I'm going to tell you, it's free. Like, you're not going to change your line makeup. You're just going to work your cast, because it's much more about, at that point, I feel, about the technique and about the way you're operating the rod than it is about the line choice. And I say this because in studying with, like Rob Worthing, and studying from Masami Sakakibara, like it doesn't matter. The line length is not a limiting or much of a factor at all, or the line size, I should say, as far as being able to cast longer. It's all in how you're working that rod, Stevie. So yeah, like basically keep working that size 3 and just keep adding longer and longer. Keep adding a foot. Every month or 2 you're fishing, and see where you're at the end of the season. See how that goes.